Howdy.
Hi. All right, so we're gonna answer your questions. The first ones who got mailed in, and then the ones that were on the chat in the webinar. So first, Jackie. She says, "I have a house with a yard of St. Augustine soil. What can I grow on that soil?" We just had a webinar. Our last one was with Terry Meir from Florida, Sebastian, Florida, right at the coast, so super sandy soil. But he turned his sandy soil on his um, village, eco village, into compost, into dirt. When compost is neutral, it's really great. It's not fertilizer, the compost that's already finished. And then he was able to grow anything. He was able to grow even comfrey. So I encourage you to watch that webinar. You can find it on our growmyownfood.com/gardening-webinars page. So Terry Meir, Growing Abundance in a Subtropical Permaculture Garden, and he goes into further detail about
Basically, essentially building biomass in the soil so that that retains all of the nutrients and kind of complements the existing sandy soil.
so you change a little bit the consistency of that sandy soil into something that's more more clay towards the more clay soil. Nadia. Okay, I have not been. Okay, she lives in a very dry climate that is very hot in the summer. When is the best time to plant and harvest? And I believe this is Arizona. So I mentioned this on the webinar as well, that yes, around now is when your climate is temperate, is nice, the weather is nicer. But then during the summer months, that's when it gets too hot, and that's when you actually start planting your garden. So,
And you should also, a lot of people in these climates, they still try to grow the same kind of things that would grow in a temperate climate. So um, I definitely recommend finding species that have adapted to the drier conditions. So the heat is a big issue, but more important than the heat is usually the dry conditions. So there's a there's a seed company,
native seeds.
Native Seeds, that sells seeds that are specifically adapted to those drier climates.
Also, urban farmer Greg Peterson is a fantastic resource in Phoenix, Arizona, for the dry climate
Especially for
plants,
fruit trees in
fruit
those dry
trees.
climates.
Elizabeth in Beaverton, Oregon. Raised beds. I'm building 18 to 24-inch tall raised beds surrounded by gravel pathways. Should the beds also be on top of gravel? If so, the roots of deep-rooted plants like tomatoes go through the gravel to find more soil? So it's better to help the plants along, and Elizabeth, and actually not plant on gravel. But if you can dig up or remove the gravel and plant your raised beds from there, you will have much better success.
And it's better to prep your beds before you start growing because once you've established life in the soil, you really don't want to disturb it that much. So the best time, if you're going to do disturbance of the soil, the best time to do it is when you're first initially preparing the beds. And that if you might think that your topsoil is not very good, but we've seen situations where the soil can be converted by the roots of the plants and the biomass and the life in the soil so that what looked like it was terrible soil suddenly became 2 feet of rich, healthy, living earth after only a few years. So I would definitely recommend removing the gravel from underneath the raised beds.
That being said, we have had clients who didn't remove the gravel. And what our advice is, you make that topsoil as big as possible, as thick as possible, and eventually you'll want to remove that gravel, I guess, if you want to redo that garden next year. Planting plants. So I'm concerned about overcrowding. My pepper and tomato plants were huge and crowded out by basil and marigolds. So based on that knowledge, knowing like the maximum diameter of your plants, when you plot out your plants, um, think of growing seasonally. So when you grow the spring crops like mosh or onions or brassicas, or peas, for instance, or fava beans, they can be around those tomato plants because come summer, those guys are gonna die fava beans and peas. And then your tomato by that time will be big enough. The basil can be somewhere farther, of course, not knowing that. And yeah, so it's kind of like you have to know the season of your plant so that the soil is always covered, but you also have to know the maximum diameter of the plant to plot it out well.
So if you want to maximize your space, just remember you have some of these star plants during the summer, things like tomatoes, the peppers that you mentioned, squash is a big plant, pumpkin, so okra is another big plant. So these ones that are big plants, you definitely don't want to be planting them too close together. And then there's little plants that have shallower roots that you can grow. Things like lettuces don't have deep roots, so you can grow them at around things that are your star players, and they won't really take up a lot of room. You can also grow vining plants
that grow up.
So things like pole beans, they'll find their way around. You don't have to. We've grown pole beans up our tomato plants, so you can even use it as a trellis.
And regarding the sprinkler and what's the best system to use, so the drip irrigation is what we recommended. And then if you want to, as I know your email, so if you wanted to email us again to get in touch with Sandy, who's in Arizona, who's the drip irrigation lady. She also has a video on how she implemented her water irrigation strategies on our website, gardening-webinars. So growmyownfood.com/gardening-webinars. And it's the one on water harvesting, something of that sort. So that one, I highly recommend you check that out because that's Sandy, the one with the drip irrigation. Diane, my backyard is east facing and is in full sun for 6 to 8 hours a day. What can I plant that won't burn up from the sun?
So actually that's not so bad because if you're on the west side, the evening sun is actually hotter than the morning sun. So there's lots of plants that like that quantity of sun. For the spring, I would recommend brassicas. They enjoy sunlight.
Carrots.
For the summer,
strawberries.
Tomatoes like sun.
All the hot peppers, squash, watermelon, heat-loving. Lemongrass, that won't burn up.
Now, if it's extreme heat as well as the sun, then you want things that can thrive even when the temperatures get above 90 degrees. So these are things like okra, peanuts do well in
sweet potatoes.
Yeah, sweet potatoes love the heat. You could, depending on your climate, you can even grow things like passion fruit that loves being baked. So,
can I plant food among roses and hydrangeas? It depends on what food and how established the roses and hydrangeas root systems are. It depends on the soil. So all these questions, disclaimer, we would really want to be with you on the ground, knowing your exact situation to give you the best advice. So this is just like a cursory overview of like the best way we can answer with your one-line questions. Can I grow veggies in containers too? I think we answered that on the webinar. Rachel, any tips and advice particular for green stalk type tower planters? Well, don't plant what they show on the box, the tower gardens. You can't plant watermelon in those. And then even if they say strawberries, if you want a few strawberries, then that's where you plant them. But if you want a lot of strawberries are runners. Those tower type gardens, they really hold herbs the best, like small herbs, cilantro, basil.
Just a quick note on strawberries. People get confused. They think that they see these videos of cascading strawberries coming out of the basket. So a lot of that depends on the type of strawberry that you're growing. If you grow the type of strawberry typically that's used in these commercial operations, they don't generate runners. So what you're looking for is plants that generate a lot of runners. That's how strawberry plants propagate, is that they send out these shoots out, and there's little crowns at the end of these, and those become a new strawberry plant. So when you're seeing these cascading things that come out, what happens is those are actually separate strawberry plants, and then they form strawberries on those plants, and you get these cascading things. So in terms of varieties for containers, You can either go with alpine varieties, which are smaller strawberries, but they really love sending out runners and cascading. And then generally June-bearing varieties will send out more runners than ever-bearing varieties.
How do I keep squirrels and chipmunks off my tomatoes? So at the end of the video, we showed how one of our clients caged their tomatoes on the deck. The other thing is to like have another lure crop of seeds that you maintain, because they eat up all the seeds there, to attract them away from your tomatoes. And another thing, like to build a fence. Really, the best way for squirrels and chipmunks is to cage. Physical barriers, deer too.
I think that's in the short term, but if you want to look kind of like longer term, our experience, we get squirrel pressure in our garden, but because our garden is so abundant, it's reached this critical point where sure the squirrel will do some annoying things. It'll just randomly dig where there's no food and dig up seedlings that we've just transplanted. But generally the pain is not so bad because squirrels prefer things like nuts and seeds, and they're going to have a preference for things like sunflower seeds over your cabbages. So we get a bit of damage, but overall that's kind of acceptable because we've built our garden to be more in harmony with the existing nature around us.
So you have some sacrificial crops there because, yeah, you always take them into consideration. Do you have any suggestion for a small backyard that accumulates too much rainwater? Presently, it's been raining for a few days and it's a bog out there. So one thing is you might consider earthwork. That's the first thing. If the water will go where it wants to go. So if your backyard is such that there is a dip, that's where the water is going to go always, no matter really what you try to plant in it, around it, because it'll always be boggy. It depends, right? I'll have to see your backyard, see how big the dip is. The second is you might want to try to terrace that. So you're doing the earthworks, so changing the landscape to capture the water in a more passive way to slow that run down. And then while you're doing the earthworks of swales or terracing, you plant trees that are water loving, like pawpaws.
For a list
Bananas.
of, if you're looking for resources on plants or trees that do well in wet, loving conditions, there's this term called riparian buffer. So I think Penn State has a nice publication on the zones next to a river or a stream, what they call a riparian buffer, and there's like zone A, zone B, zone C. Zone A is closest to the river. It's the most water-loving trees, and they have a nice list there in their publication on what are the best trees that could grow on the riverbanks in the water, kind of thing. So I recommend that as a follow-up.
Thank you. And Charis asks, can you use wood chips in swales at raised bed edge in combination with roof water runoff to be a multi-purpose path or swale? So we showed that we did just that, but we didn't use wood chips, as the path. We used rock on top because the wood chips eventually will disintegrate into soil, and that means that you'll have stuff growing on your path. So we used rock as in the path. And yeah, it works. So go check that out at the end, towards the middle of the webinar.
Done.
What systems and routines do you have in place to make sure that all your plants are well watered? Trisha Michua.
The first place that we're blessed in the climate that gets a lot of rain, but one of the first things that we take care of is making sure that our plants are mulched appropriately. So even if you're in a dry climate, this benefits you because it starts to prevent evaporation. You can prevent 25% of the evaporation that you would normally get. So that means you don't have to water as much, and it retains the more water underneath the mulch. Ideally, you would like to have a living mulch. So this is like a green cover, a ground cover, what they call a ground cover crop. that you're putting in all these holes and spaces around your other crops that works in concert with those crops, but protects, it acts as a barrier, and then all the moisture is stored in the roots. Now, in terms of watering cycles, it's usually generally better to do a deep watering once a day in either the uh, evening or the morning than it is to do lots of little sprinklings throughout the day. So I would recommend, instead of having some kind of sprinkler hose where you're wasting a lot of water and it's not really doing anything, that it would be better that you get either a watering can or a timer on your watering system so that it works in the early morning or the early evening, so you get the maximum bang for your buck in terms of watering.
How do you create swales and or new beds around 1 to 4 year old trees? I'm worried about injuring or disturbing root systems while creating swales and using cardboard or wood chips to suppress grass and create a food forest. So Dave we talked about this. You have to put the swale a little bit outside of the drip line so that you don't disturb the roots and the roots grow in. They'll still get that water. So farther away if you can, or a smaller swale.
And if you're going to grow things, not a swale, but you're going to grow things closer to the tree, then look at the root system of the tree. Does it send its roots down or does it send its roots out? So you can include things that have shallower roots or the roots that are more vertical, things like bulbs. So a lot of alliums are good. Things like horseradish grow well under trees.
Cabbage worms question. So we had this on the chat. We had this yesterday in a Zoom check-in with one of our DIY clients, and cabbage worms are a big deal. So I think one is, what did I say? Trichogramma brassicae. Arbico Organics has something for parasitic wasps to eat the cabbage worms, and that's something you can add onto the soil if it's a very invasive thing in your backyard. Or
I think the seasonality. So there's two things you can do. If you're very diligent about periodically early in the season when your brassicas are getting established, if you check the underside of the leaves, you can usually nip these things early in the bud and pick them off. Now, if you for whatever reason, maybe that's a little hard to do, or you're having trouble finding all of them. If the pressure is really bad, there's two things that I recommend. One is that you look at this when you're growing the brassicas, because there's specific seasonality for when the cabbage moths, they're these little white, they actually look quite nice, these little white butterfly moths, and they're the ones that are turning into the cabbage worms. So they generally come in the late spring or the early fall. So if you can protect your plants during those times, or you can grow your plants at a different time, then you avoid that whole cycle. If you have really heavy pressure, then I would recommend putting row cover over your brassicas during those critical periods, and then that way the moths won't lay eggs around the brassicas.
Can I use shredded paper for mulch? In Arizona, it's very dry here. Yes, you can, but it has to be wet. You have to wet your compost in Arizona. You have to turn it every other day. We have a video, a webinar on hot composting in 18 days, which actually worked in Arizona. So gardening-webinars, growmyownfood.com. Look at the webinars page and look for the one that says composting. What is diatomaceous earth for? I got some as a gift at a nursery and I want to use it, but I don't know how. Good question. We use it for anything that's a beetle that we don't want. Cockroaches. The diatomaceous earth, unwanted beetles like cucumber beetles in the garden.
Yeah, there's downsides to diatomaceous earth. It's okay if you're in a drier climate, because then you can dust it on the surface of leaves. It's harmless to humans, but it's anything that has a carapace. So a lot of these insects will crawl over it, and it has these microscopic sharp edges that kind of tear the carapace. The downside for that is it works on beneficial insects as well. So it's one of these universals. And then the big downside is that as soon as it rains, it just gets washed away.
Mm.
So I would use it on more like container plants or things that might not get a lot of rain.
In GIY, is design an aspect that is focused in on and assisted with? Absolutely. So the second module is design. We go right away into design, and then we break that down, and then you consult your design with us.
Yeah.
And in a few months, we're going to actually have a garden tool, an app. That's the Garden Designer, which is in beta now. If you're a DIYer, you get a sneak peek into it. But we really, design is the heart of permaculture. Permaculture is not a method. It's not gardening methods or techniques. Permaculture is design, intentional design, so that you maximize production and everything works efficiently and there's no waste. So good question. And Mira, we will see you on a consult soon. Deborah, Soul, are you guided by the patterns of the moon? Yes. So we
touched on this briefly.
Yes,
in the
answer.
Yeah, but if you're really interested in that, I suggest you look into this thing called biodynamics. There's a German philosopher slash farmer, Rudolf Steiner, who investigated that a lot more, and that talks about the gravitational effect of the moon and how that might affect plants and how you could plant according to the cycles of the moon. So I recommend following up on biodynamic planting.
Yeah, so there is like if it's a new moon, usually plants underground seeds starting is recommended, something of that sort. And but you have to look it up to make sure, because I have to look it up every time too. Anyone tried radish cover crop for aeration? Yes. So I tried daikon radish. And at first I thought that I would get compacted soil because they would grow so close together. But that was not the case. My soil actually became fluffy. So if you use mangels, radishes every single year like farmers do, then you will get compacted soil. But if you have a bad spot that's super compacted and you want to aerate it naturally, then just cover crop it with radish sprouts, or I think that's a great way to go about it.
I also recommend trying some perennial plants that have these deep tap roots, because they're kind of like clod busters. The roots are so strong and they go deep, so they can really dig out tough soil.
Cardoon.
So cardoon, Turkish rocket, burdock, comfrey, borage. All of these things have a single or a thick main taproot that will drill down and extract. Mallows have a good root as well.
Marigolds used to have a strong smell. Is there a specific type that is best for tomatoes? It's Mexican marigolds, according to John Jevons, who's an amazing farmer in California. So Mexican marigolds. Oh, the answer is here. So Nancy, would you plant things with shallow roots between things with deep roots? Yes, and that's we have something called a 7 plant layers webinar, and also it's touched on in another webinar called the Designing Your Food Forest. So that is definitely how permaculture works. Every little niche, every little cranny, even under the soil, we try to do deep tap root things and shallow root things. I have a massive pile of leaves left over from the fall. Can I use them as mulch year round? Yes. And they will disintegrate faster if they're like scattered this way and the rain falls on them. They may disintegrate faster also if you turn them in your mulch bin, if you have a compost bin. What about groundhogs? You have experience with that.
Well, I mean, aside from catching them, the best thing is with a groundhog is to have a fence, because they're omnivores, so they'll just eat all of your different plants. So if they've taken a specific liking to your liking to your vegetable garden, then and they won't bury very deep, so you don't have to put the fence too far deep, but just having a fence around your garden is probably the best way to deal with them.
Okay, Damien, you asked about powdery mildew, and there is a company called Commonwealth Seeds, which does research. So they have, if they go to commonwealthseeds.org or .com, you'll see a little tab that says research, and if you click on that, you'll see all the seed trials that they tested different varieties, heirloom varieties, for resistance to downy mildew. So it could be you're using the same variety every year, and that variety is not resistant, is susceptible to powdery mildew.
Now, in general, cucurbits get a lot of diseases, and there's quite a lot of pests that target the squash, summer squash, and winter squash. There's 4 different subspecies: Maxima, Mixta, Peppo, and Moscata. And Moscata, which is kind of like your butternut squash varieties, is the most resistant. So unfortunately, everybody pushes Maxima, and they look good, and they're kind of like your classical pumpkin or squash, but they're the most susceptible, and they're targeted the most for things like powdery mildew, etc. So I would also recommend trying the Moscata, the butternut squash varieties, and see if that solves a lot of your powdery mildew problems.
What is the link for GIY? So GIY.thinkific.com, GIY.thinkific.com. We hope we'll see you inside the program, and that this has been helpful. Oh, do you have a fertilizer plan? Last question. That is Bonnie Smith.
So usually we generate a lot of compost over the winter, and I'll just remove that compost and layer it as mulch all over the garden initially. And then later on in the year, for things like tomatoes, I'll do something called side dressing. So side dressing is essentially just adding a little bit of extra boost. So what I'll do is generate compost tea. So if you only have a little bit of compost and you're like, okay, how am I going to spread this to my entire garden? There's this thing called compost tea, where it extends, is essentially using the compost that you have as an inoculant to create more life forms. And what you're really interested in is the life forms, because the life forms will then break down things in the soil into a form that's easily uptaked by the plants. So you can generate compost tea as a kind of root drenching, just to boost things in the summer. You could also do foliar sprays, which is a way to kind of get nutrition directly into the plant leaves.
Especially so there's things for trees.
Yeah, so for things like that, you can take seaweed and create a foliar spray that's a great boost for your plants in the midsummer.
So I hope that answers. That's it. 28 minutes. Thanks again, and I hope this has been helpful. Bye. Bye.